Hey guys, welcome back to Open to Truth. My name's Tony, and on this week's episode, Clint and I had a conversation with Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott. She's an archaeologist, a real-life archaeologist, first one I'd ever met, and she specializes in home dwellings. So not so much temples and palaces and all of that, but like the everyday life of ancient people. So we had a fascinating conversation about that and about how that informs how we read the Bible and our relationship to Scripture. And I just wanted to give you a quick heads up. Listen, I made a blunder. I accidentally recorded 2 copies of Clint's mic and 0 copies of my mic. So anything I say in this episode, the audio will be captured from either the camera microphone or Clint's microphone bumped up a ton. Anyway, it's not going to sound good when I speak, but thankfully I don't do very much talking in this episode. It's mostly Cynthia and Clint, and they sound great. So hope you can forgive me for that, put up with that, and enjoy the conversation.
Well, welcome back to Open to Truth, a podcast all about exploring big ideas and discovering truth together. My name's Clint.
Hi, I'm Tony.
And we have a special guest today. We're doing, again, kind of this Google Meet version of Open to Truth. We have Dr. Cynthia Shafer-Elliott. She's the Associate Dean and Associate Professor at William Jessup University. And she is a real-life archaeologist.
I've never met one before. You're the first one I've ever met, so I'm so stoked.
Yeah, welcome to the podcast, Cynthia.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So one thing we like to start with typically are people's stories, and I would just love for you to share with us and our audience, what is your story? Like, what drew you to archaeology? Was there a person, an experience, an idea, maybe like some course in college?
A movie, maybe?
Yeah. that drew you in. Why did you decide to pursue it?
You know, it never really crossed my mind till I went to college. I always loved history, in particular ancient history, and even more particular history of ancient Israel. And I loved it. And I was actually good at history. I was never a good student. So when I found something that I loved, I just dove right in and I grew up in a Christian home, and you know, our third place was our church. So we were always at church. And I loved it though. And so when I went away to college, I went to a small private liberal arts college in Northern California, where we were required to take, biblical studies and theology classes as part of our general ed. And I remember my very first semester being in an introduction to Old Testament class. And I just remember sitting there thinking like, oh my goodness, I really love this. And I was remembering a lot of stuff from, as a kid. And I just really thought that was so cool. And I loved it. And I just wanted to keep studying it. So I did. Yeah. And the same professor that taught that class, he did a class also on biblical backgrounds, which was all about the culture and customs and manners of the biblical world. And I just really loved that. And then that same professor also did study tours to Israel. And I went as a sophomore in college, and we did a dig for a day at the caves of Mauritius. And we found nothing. We found maybe some pigeon bones, but it was so strange because I didn't care. I say I didn't find anything, but I found a passion and I loved it. And I think because to me, archaeology was history that you could see and that you could touch. Mm-hmm. It seemed more real to me in a way. And there's lots of different types of archaeologies, but the one that really resonated with me was kind of giving more of the historical and cultural background of whatever history you're studying. And so it was on that trip where it was my first trip to Israel, and I fell in love with it, my first excavation, and I fell in love with it. And so I've been pursuing it ever since.
Yeah. I think that's a common experience. Like when I went to seminary, had the Old Testament survey class. Oh, yeah. Now, I never went on a dig, but even in the book, I'm looking at least pictures of these steles and different like monument, and this is how we can corroborate, like, here's David in the historical archaeological record. And I thought that was really moving.
It brings it to life, you know.
Yeah.
That's what I so enjoyed. Like I was telling Clint the other week, one of my favorite classes in my undergrad was just an ancient history class that was like story to this guy came in and told the story of humanity from beginning through, I don't know, the 1500 or something like that. But he would just talk for like 3 hours. It's like fantastic. It brought all of that to life, especially scripture. So
that you're not really getting if I were just to crack open my Bible, let's say, and just start reading through Kings.
Right.
You know, I'm missing so much of all this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, so you're a professional archaeologist, what's one of the biggest misconceptions of that field? I like to pick people's brains about kind of insider knowledge. I'm guessing it's not like Indiana Jones and explosive adventures. You're getting all these treasures. What does an archaeologist really do?
Like that.
Yeah. Can you give us a snapshot into
rats? You know, like just like every discipline, there is lots of insider knowledge, I guess you could say. But I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that people think archaeology is just like black and white, that there's no gray, and that's so not true. I mean, archaeology is just as subject to interpretation as biblical study is, because I do both biblical studies and archaeology, and biblical studies is all about interpretation and all the tools you use for interpretation. And people think that archaeology is just, well, it is what it is. And it's like, no, actually it's not, because you can have, let's say I'm on my site and me and my other staff members are looking at whatever it is we found, and maybe there's 4 of us, but there's going to be 12 different opinions. Yeah. So it's not black and white a lot of the times. Most of the time, it's just as subject to interpretation as anything else is. And once you get into reading or being part of that world, even such a small world like mine, where we're focusing on the archaeology of ancient Israel and Judah and its neighbors, there's a lot of discussion about everything. There's not really a consensus on anything. Yeah. And that's okay. And that's the way scholarship's supposed to be, where we're constantly looking and constantly studying and reevaluating things after we learn more information, as we get more tools that are helpful, more technology. So it's not as clear cut as I think most people like to think it is, because you hear people say that all the time. Well, the biblical, archaeologists found this and they found this, so that means this. It's like,
right, yeah.
Well, actually.
So I love that you use the word interpretation. I'm wondering, are there any basic principles of interpretation that every archaeologist would know? I'm just thinking through, my background is biblical interpretation, and one of the rules is like stick to the genre that it's supposed to be, like read it as the genre that it's supposed to be,
Right.
Start there.
Yeah,
so would there be anything similar in the realm of archaeology? How do you even start interpreting?
Right. Well, there's lots of different types of archaeology. So just like within biblical studies, we have, you could say we have, the way I say it to my students is we have a toolbox, right? And you've got lots of different criticisms, which are like tools in the toolbox. And just like you would say, and the way I say to my students, the form of a passage helps determine the function of a passage. The same with archaeology, in that where you're excavating, the space that you're excavating is really important. Because so one of the things that I like is what we call spatial analysis. And so it's not just about what you find, it's also about where you find it and where that thing is found in relationship to other things. Okay. So for instance, if you're excavating a house, and that architecture is really important, you're not going to expect to find monumental type things in a domestic environment. If you do, then wow, there's something really strange going on. But then also, you know, looking at, okay, I'm in this space in this house, and I find an oven. Okay, that's great, an oven. Where is that oven located in the house? Where is it in relationship to the other finds that we've excavated or have found in that same space? What's the distance between them? You know, and how do those things that we find help us interpret what happened in that space?
Yeah. Wow.
That's just one example.
That's super intriguing.
So along those lines, in household archaeology, what's one of the more surprising things that you found out? Because I'm thinking now, when I've read scripture, I feel like I'm not seeing a lot of details about the everyday life of people in these stories, and of course, it's spanning hundreds or thousands of years or whatever. So I'm sure the everyday life of someone in a Genesis story would be far different from, you know, someone in Kings, let's say. But yeah, anything surprising that you've learned? Like, what was the everyday life of someone in one of those households really like?
Yeah, and I think everyday life is when you're wanting to look at, you know, everyday life. It's when archaeology is probably more helpful than text, whether it's a biblical text or other ancient Near Eastern texts, because texts are written by elite urban males for the most part, you know, and their motivation for writing is very different than what people in a society where everyone is literate. You know, take for instance today, where, you know, we're all writing little things every day for the whole world to see. You know, that's very different than their world. So if you think about when people are writing, when men, elite urban men are writing texts, and that their motivation for writing is monumental motivation. You're documenting the kings, the priests, the battles, the temples, the palaces, all these monumental places of prestige, as some scholars have called it. And that rarely reflects daily life. So when we want to look at daily life, we have to shift our attention from the monumental to the everyday, to the mundane. And that would be the home. That's the stage where daily life still occurs, you know, for most of us at least, especially during the quarantine.
Yeah.
But where, you know, if we really want to understand the cultural and social world of ancient Israel and Judah during, especially, let's say, the Iron Age, which, if your listeners aren't familiar with that, it's roughly from 1200 BCE to 586 BCE. And that's roughly the time period that most of the Old Testament events occurred in. That is reflected in the Hebrew Bible is normally that time period. I mean, give or take, you know, some beginning and the end. But so if you're thinking about, like, okay, well, what did they do? How did they live? What did their houses look like? You know, what did they cook? How did they produce things? You know, what kind of animals did they raise? What kind of crops did they grow? We can use the biblical text, but that's not the point of the text. The point of the text isn't to provide, you know, recipes on a day about daily life. It's not intended to give a daily account of your average ancient Israelite man, woman, or child. It's all about the monumental. And if something about daily life is part of the story, part of the setting of the narrative, then yeah, you get glimpses of it. So we want to use the biblical text, but we also want to use everything else at our disposal, which would include other ancient Near Eastern texts. In particular, I'm thinking of, like, if you're thinking of food, which is something I study a lot of, the Yale Babylonian culinary recipes that, you know, those are, again, elite contexts, but we can still get a really good idea of some of the recipes that they had. most of which don't sound very appetizing to me. But that's neither here nor there.
What did you call that? The Yale Babylon recipes?
Yeah, so it's a collection of Babylonian tablets that are recipes from Babylon that are housed at Yale University.
Wow.
And I used them quite a bit for my doctoral dissertation, and I'm really pleased to see that they've become they're more out there now on social media and stuff, and you can have more access to them. But yeah, they're fascinating. They talk about, lots of different types of breads and cheeses and stews, and it's great stuff. And it gives us, even though it's in Babylon, it's still part of that ancient Near Eastern world that Israel was a part of.
Yeah.
And even though it's elite context, it could still give us a glimpse into what kind of ingredients were accessible, what kind of meals they were preparing, that things were not as kind of static as they could have been. Maybe very different from for your average person, but still, not too bad.
So I'm kind of wondering this, and my apologies if it's not in the Iron 1, Iron 2 specialty, but how similar would the everyday life of someone in 600 BC be to someone in the time of Jesus? Because I'm reading some of these stories, and like I don't know, Jesus is out by the Mount of Olives or something, and a whole crowd comes. Well, what were they doing do they work during the day? And how do they have all this free time to be traveling around the countryside? And yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think there would have been a lot of similarities in that, this is your average ancient Israelite would have been what we call agro-pastoralists. So they would have been farmers, they would have been growing crops and raising herds. Now, but by the time you get into Jesus's time, things are more urban than they would have been during the Iron Age. You also have a lot more specialization in trade during Jesus's time. Not that you didn't have that in the Iron Age, but that's a big difference between the 8th century BCE and the 1st century CE or AD. And of course, a lot happens between those two time periods. You've got the exile, and you've got the Greeks and Hellenization, and you got the Romans. So a lot of things have changed by that time. One of the biggest changes that I like to emphasize in my archaeology in the New Testament classes, with Hellenism, this rise of leisure, activities of leisure like bathhouses and gymnasium and libraries, and of course more people being literate, and theaters and things like that, which you don't really have in the Iron Age, but you do have during Jesus's time.
Have there been any, and I'm sorry if this is a question you're planning on asking,
That's okay.
but how has, and this might be too broad of a question, but how has your experience in archaeology informed the way you approach scripture? Has it changed how you relate to it, or how you see it as a collection of documents? I mean, do you see the Bible the way as a collection of ancient texts like any other that you would find, or how has it changed your relationship with scripture?
Yeah, I think it would have to, affect it.
Yeah.
I gave a talk once to a seminary, and somebody asked a similar question, and about archaeology and biblical studies, I said something then that when I said it, I kind of had that aha moment as I said it. And it still rings true. I think biblical studies and archaeology have really helped me keep my faith.
Wow.
Right? Because I'm such a head person, that I have all these questions, and I love questions. I'm I'm one of those people that's like, no, don't be afraid to ask questions. Actually, questions are so good. Don't be afraid to ask questions. And that seems to happen a lot within religious communities, but in particular, Protestant evangelical communities, where you're not encouraged to ask questions. In fact, you may be outright discouraged from it. Right. And that was never the case with me. However, I think it was the questions, and it was the research, and it was the digging, and it was the, getting into the text that kept me there. I think I don't know where it would be otherwise. I'm such a head person that my head and heart are very much connected. So for me, people get a little uneasy when I ask tough questions, and especially in the classroom, when you have students who are really unfamiliar with, proper biblical studies, with how archaeology can and can't help us with the biblical text. Because most of the time people in general, will see archaeology as only a way they only see it as like almost like a weapon to prove or disprove the Bible.
Yeah.
On either side. And I think any proper biblical scholar and archaeologist don't approach it that way. They don't approach it as a weapon. They approach it as a tool, but not a weapon.
And even that posture of using archaeology as a weapon to prove something about the Bible, I think, is bringing to the table some assumptions about what the Bible even is and what, I don't know, theological oomph you're getting to your whole view of Scripture and everything. Right. But I'm kind of curious, so what are there any, just tell us a story, like a particular experience. Did you find something in the ground one time that really brought something to life, or
other than pigeon bones?
Right. Have you found something beyond pigeon bones? Yeah.
That's really funny. In fact, I'm going to use this as a little illustration.
Oh, perfect. It's been there the whole time.
So, you always you're always hoping for the big stuff, like big inscriptions. Sure. I'd be really happy if I found, another collection of scrolls, like the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
The
Shafer-Elliott scrolls.
Right? And people always ask, so you found the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
What about Noah's Ark? I'm like, oh, come on. Those are just some of the, the oldest questions related to archaeology in the Bible ever. And I get it. People are interested in those things, but those are pretty sensational things. Yeah. And I have found some pretty cool things, but honestly, the things that get me every time is something like this. I'll just explain what this is. This is a broken piece of a handle from a jug, and it's a small one, but you can see where the body was, and here's the little handle part here. And so the way they made at least at certain points, in the Iron Ages, they would make pots through using a potter's wheel. But then the handles, they would have to they made them as in a mold, and they would have to press them onto the jug or the jar, whatever it is you're making. So when you're, excavating and you're finding even a broken piece like this, especially if it's like a handle, I love putting my hands here because you can feel sometimes where the potter was pressing the handle onto the jar. And to me, that just is like so cool. And sometimes you can even see a thumbprint.
Wow.
And I just sit there in awe thinking, who made this? Why did they make it? How did they make it? Who ended up using it? How did they use it? How long did they use it for? Why did they leave it behind? What are the stories behind the artifacts? I love the artifacts, I do. But to me, the story behind the artifact is really is really cool. And even just finding something little like this, which is really kind of inconsequential to the big, it's not like a big monumental find. It doesn't have an inscription on it. It doesn't, say, David was here,
Yeah.
although that would be really cool. But, it's these type of things where I can feel them. And to me, that just is so profound, where I am the first person to see this, to touch this in thousands of years.
Yeah, sure.
And
That's awesome.
Now, I'm just, how did you find that thing? That is that's 2,500 years old or something, buried in the ground. Did you get off the plane at Tel Aviv in Israel with a spade and just walk 15 paces and start digging? Like, where do you find such a thing?
How do you choose where to dig?
I'm going to use this question as an opportunity to plug
Okay.
one of my books because of those same questions that I would get all the time. So I edited a volume called The 5-Minute Archaeologist in the Southern Levant, because the Southern Levant is the region ancient Israel is in. And it's lots of different archaeologists contribute little chapters. The chapters are like not even probably 1,000 words, a lot less. And they're all answering questions like this. How do you decide where to dig? Who decides where to dig? How do you decide to dig there? How do you dig? Who gets to keep it? What kind of political implications are there and stuff like that. So all sorts of different questions. But no, you can't just get off a plane and start digging.
Sure.
But you can volunteer on an excavation in Israel. We've got loads of them. I mean, this last summer we didn't, because we weren't allowed to with everything. But anyone can volunteer on excavation, and these excavations are directed and run and funded by universities, both in Israel and the US and in Europe, from all over the world, Australia. And so we've got people from all over the world, scholars from all over the world, who are on staff on different excavations, and they have a reason for excavating. Like they have a series of research questions they're trying to answer, and depends on the time period they're interested, or the geographical location, so anyone can, whether you have any experience or knowledge or background in history or archaeology or Bible or whatever, anyone can volunteer on these excavations. And we find so much pottery, because everything was made out of pottery, that we collect it all, and then we read it afterwards, after it's been properly washed, because it's been sitting in the dirt for a really long time. So we wash it, we let it dry, and then the next day we do what we call a pottery reading. And we determine, people who are experts in ceramics will say, oh, this is from this time period, and this is from this time period, and this is from this time period. And then we keep the indicative pieces, because you're asking me how I got this piece, so
Yeah.
I don't want you to think I stole it. This is why I'm giving you this little bit of information.
Sure.
But we have a big pot. We keep certain indicative pieces that have handles or rims or have decoration or something like that, if they're broken. And then the pieces that we don't keep, we have a big pile of pottery shards. You can just imagine Job sitting on there.
Sure. Right. Scratching his boils.
But and then the volunteers can take pieces home. So I've got a big basket of pottery shards at my office, but I've got a couple little things here. So.
Have you ever been able to put one back together, these different shards, and reconstruct a vase or something?
Yeah, in fact, so I'm on staff on 2 sites right now, and one of the sites is we're on hiatus, because after you dig for a while, you have to start, with all the lab work, you have to start with all the analysis and the writing up and publishing. So the site that's on hiatus right now is called Tel Halif, and that's in southern Israel. And it is an Iron Age Old Testament site. And so we have been spending the last several summers taking the pieces of different of the house, because we've been excavating a particular house. We're doing household archaeology there. So this house that we've been excavating, we found the floor. So this house was destroyed, this whole village, this whole town. It's about 10 to 12 acres in size. It had a city wall around it, but it was one of the 46 towns and villages destroyed by Sennacherib in 701 BCE.
Wow. Well, that's huge. That's a lot to excavate. 10 to 12
Yes,
acres.
at the time of King Hezekiah, Isaiah the prophet. So the whole so the Syrians were really well known for setting fire to things. So when they set fire to Halif, as they did to most of their places, like the top floor of the house collapsed onto the first floor of the house. And so the rubble from the top floor would seal the first floor. So everything that those people left behind when they fled, hopefully they fled, is still there. And it's burnt and it's probably in pieces. Most of it is in pieces. So when we excavate in such a way to where we can try, so like the first floor of this house, we found this one part of the floor, there was a ton of broken storage jars. And so we were able to excavate it in such a way to where we could try to put them back together again. And so we've been doing that for the last several summers, is trying to reconstruct a lot of these vessels. It's really hard though. I am not
Sounds
good
really
at it
hard.
at all.
I think I'd be afraid to go volunteer. I'd take my pickaxe and break something valuable.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sorry, this is a little bit morbid, but when you're, like, if this was a village that was attacked, and have you ever found, like, human remains? Like, they didn't get out of the house in time, and I'm sure that's comes up.
Sometimes you do. I mean, not so far at Halif, really. It's really unusual to find skeletal remains inside a city wall, like, because I mean, it would have been unhygienic. So if you could, you would bury them outside, in the family tombs or whatever. But if you're in a moment of crisis like this, no, we don't have like a Pompeii type thing. That's unfortunate. But you do find, sometimes you do, but it's uncommon. But when you do, you have to keep it really like secret, because your dig could get shut down if it comes out that you have a lot of skeletal remains.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I won't press you further on that one.
She's never seen one.
Yeah. So no, that you don't see them. Yeah. So one thing we talk about all the time on this podcast are the intellectual virtues, being curious, intellectual humility, open-mindedness, courage to
Ask questions.
to overturn your beliefs in the face of countervailing evidence. You mentioned earlier, and even in your story of the indicative piece of shards and which age they belong in, I imagine there would be disagreement amongst archaeologists as to, what time period this is and what we can infer from this find. Mm-hmm. How have you seen like these intellectual virtues best played out in your field? How does that work when you encounter disagreement in your field? How does that get resolved? And
do different archaeologists have their pet interpretation that they really want to push, and does it get nasty?
Yeah. It does get nasty sometimes, yeah. A good example of this, which you may have heard of back in the early 2000s, was this whole chronology debate. So there's this well-known Israeli archaeologist named Israel Finkelstein, and he was being brave, trying to put forward new ideas based on the data as he interpreted it. And it was pretty counter to the traditional way of doing things. And so, of course, there were people on the traditional side who just got, really upset because it was challenging a lot of the previous way they'd done things, and challenging that there even was, challenging the historical reliability of the biblical text. And so, of course, people took that very
It's really heated,
seriously.
probably. Yeah.
It got really heated. It really did. It has since calmed down, thank goodness. But yeah, it happens. We all take our work seriously. The problem is when we take ourselves too seriously. When we're not able to listen. I think the thing about academics is we like to talk, but we're not so good at listening sometimes, myself included. So I think it can be hard when we take, our positions, personally, like we hold them so tightly to who we are that when somebody challenges them, we can take that pretty serious, personally. And so some scholars are better at that than others. I can think of, for example, another Israeli archaeologist named Ami Mazar, or Amihai, but he goes by Ami Mazar, and he's also one of the more well-known, well-respected Israeli archaeologists of this time period. And he and Professor Finkelstein are friends. They disagreed, but they disagreed politely and professionally. And in fact, Ami, saw some value in Israel Finkelstein's work and made some modifications to his own ideas. So that's a really good example of how it can be done. But I think, they're just like in any discipline, we take it personally and as opposed to saying, okay, well, how can I learn from this? What is a way that I can, you want to look at the information, the data, and the scholarship and go, okay, I agree with this, I disagree with that, and that's okay. But it's when people get, personal, and sometimes you read these reviews and people can be not so nice. It's like, no, let's keep it professional. Don't attack their character or person because you disagree with them. So it can, unfortunately, it can get a little bit nasty.
Well, as we kind of wind down, I'd like to ask you, what would your advice be to our audience who are largely not archaeologists, nor, as far as we know, and are not biblical scholars by trade? What's your advice for them to take? What should they be gleaning from the findings of archaeology? How should they relate that to their faith and how they read the Bible? Any words of wisdom for just the common folk that won't be on digs and yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much you could say to that. I think one of my biggest things that I try to encourage people in is one, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to do the reading yourself, like especially when it's related to the Bible. People think they know what's in the Bible, but they don't often read it themselves. Mm-hmm. They know what's in it based on what they hear in church, or maybe a podcast or something. I don't know, sure. But they're not doing the reading themselves. And I say to my students all the time, don't take my word for it. Read it, and think about it for yourself, and don't be afraid to ask the questions. And archaeology, I would say, don't put so much pressure on archaeology to save the Bible, to save Christianity, because it's not going to. Archaeologists are not concerned with saving any kind of text. We're just doing our thing, and we're trying to learn as much about ancient Israel and ancient Judah as we can from both the ground, and then there's people like me who do from the ground and the text. So I think people put a lot of pressure on archaeology as like apologetics, and it's not apologetics.
Yeah.
And it's really unfair to put that kind of pressure on archaeology and archaeologists, because that's not what they're interested in. They're not interested in saving your faith. You know,
Right.
they want to just learn as much as they can about ancient Israel and Judah. And if it helps your faith, fantastic, great. But don't expect them to do that for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
Does
so
that sound too harsh?
no, but what should I do then if I come across in my, let's say I do go to read some archaeological paper, a finding, and I discern that, oh no, this seems to go against some claim made in scripture. Oh no, what do I do?
Surely you've run into this.
Oh, sure, yeah, all the time. And I think part of that is because people have a very kind of simplified view of what the Bible is too. And I'm not being judgmental or critical here. I'm just saying that when you, within biblical studies, as you guys know, it's, if we take into consideration that these are people, whatever your idea of inspiration is, keep that in mind, but that we have people who have been writing these things over this collection of books that we have is a collection of material written and collected and redacted over a very long period of time, and there's multiple voices in it. And the point is not to provide you with every minute detail. You're going to have stories about the same event or same person that are going to be different from each other. And that's okay, because they're from different perspectives, different motivations. And we tend to put historical standards on the biblical text, modern historical standards on the biblical text, that it, in the ancient Near Eastern world, never would have put upon itself.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So when we talk about the historical reliability of the Bible, a good way to keep in mind is that, the Bible is historiography. It's what do people choose to include and exclude in what they're documenting? Why did they choose to include, what somebody looks like versus what they don't look, or exclude that? Because what they look like is important to the story, right? So there's so much stuff in the biblical text that, is, we're not going to find in archaeology. It's just because it's very different. And so archaeology and biblical studies and the biblical text, while they are related, they're not used to prove or disprove each other. And I think that's a lot of pressure to put both on biblical studies and archaeology, but allow them to do their thing. And, just because we have no historical anchors for, let's say, Abraham, because we don't, outside the biblical text, that's okay. It's not, that's fine. It's not archaeology or death. Just because we don't have it doesn't mean we don't have it yet, or it doesn't mean that we haven't found it yet, or it doesn't mean that there isn't a greater point to those stories too. So there's just so much to keep in mind. I'm sorry, I'm babbling.
No, that's really good. I mean, yeah,
But
why can't we just focus on...
There's a lot of pressure on both biblical studies and archaeology to make us feel better.
Right, there's got to be more to these stories. Like, let's just pick on Genesis for a second, that I could learn or grow spiritually, or come in contact with some theological truth that's totally apart from, as you mentioned earlier, finding the ark or Noah's Ark. Like, okay, I mean, that would be crazy to find something like that, but there's more going on in these stories than hoping one day someone digs up these pieces of it.
I think our modern historical standards, we want things to be like, oh, the date in the text, and we want to find supportive evidence that these people existed, and that's just not the way the ancient people did things.
Mhm.
And to put our modern historical standards on them is unfair to them, I think. And but that's okay.
Well, where can people learn more about this? How can we find you online? What projects are coming up that you'd love to point our audience to grow as budding archaeologists themselves?
Well, first, I always put out an invitation out there that if anyone ever wants to come volunteer on a dig, you're more than welcome to come to mine. I'm currently excavating at a site in northern Israel called Tel Abel Beit Ma'akah. It is mentioned in the Old Testament in 2 Samuel 20, with the wise woman of Ma'akah who throws the head of Sheba, the rebel, over the wall.
Wow.
That classic tale.
It's a classic tale, yeah. We're hoping to excavate this summer, Lord willing. So that's always an open invitation. Also, I am working on a few projects. I have a couple co-editing projects that are coming out this next year. One is The Hunt for Ancient Israel. It is a volume in honor of my doctoral advisor, Diana Edelman. That will be published with Equinox in the early spring. And that's pretty academic-y, but this other project is the T&T Clark Handbook of Food in the Hebrew Bible and Ancient Israel that I'm co-editing. And that will be published next year sometime too. So if you've ever been interested, and that's for anybody, it's not super academic-y. I don't know if academic-y is a word, but it is now, I suppose.
I'll allow it,
but anything you've ever wanted to know about, things that they grew, that they raised, how they cooked, what they cooked, how we find it in different parts of the Bible and archaeology and all that stuff. So that will be next year. I'm also doing a class for the podcast, The Bible for Normal People, on daily life in ancient Israel. And that's going to be every Tuesday night in October. So that's coming up in a couple of weeks here. And you can go to their website to find out more.
Absolutely. And we'll put all of that in the show notes, all those different opportunities. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for sharing your expertise. And I can tell over the airwaves that you are passionate about this. I'm glad you're out there in the sun, digging away, finding things out for us.
What was sorry, just to go over it again, you said 5-Minute Archaeologist was the name of the book with all the FAQ?
Yeah, that's good, yeah.
Yeah, so I have a monograph from my PhD dissertation, which is also very academic-y, but it's Food in Ancient Judah. And then the 5-Minute Archaeologist, I think it was published in 2016. You can find that on Amazon. So the 5-Minute Archaeologist in the Southern Levant. And it's small, it's easy to read. It's not something you have to read from beginning to end. You can kind of jump all over the place, but we really try to answer all those same kind of questions that people generally ask an archaeologist, those same type of questions that we were talking about today. So and I'm on social media. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I've got my Jessup website. I'm out there. You can find me.
Well, thanks so much, and thank you for watching another episode of Open to Truth. Be sure to like, subscribe down below, leave a rating and review on your favorite podcast provider. We'd love to hear from you and answer any questions or topics that you have live on the podcast. So we'll see you next time.
Thanks for watching. Stay curious.